Welcome, everyone, to the 7th episode of Identity International's second webinar series, Palestinian Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of December on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 5 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, where we'll delve into the evolution of Palestinian identity with our esteemed guests. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms. And if you miss any of our episodes, please check out our YouTube channel. Today, we will be in conversation with Professor Ilan Pappe. Ilan is a social activist, historian, and professor at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter. He is also the director of the university's European Centre of Palestinian Studies and the co-director of the Exeter Centre for Ethno-Political Studies. He has previously served as a senior lecturer in the political science department at the University of Haifa, and was the chair of the Emil Touma Institute for Palestinian and Israeli Studies in Haifa. He is the author of a number of books, including his notable work, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Ilan was also formerly a leading member of the Hadash and was on the party list in the 1996 Knesset elections. He graduated from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1978 and in 1984 obtained his PhD in history from the University of Oxford under the guidance of Albert Hourani and Roger Owen. He currently resides in England. Ilan, thanks for joining us today.
A pleasure to be with you this evening.
Now, the first question I would like to pose to you, as we do to all our guests, what does it mean to you personally to be a Palestinian?
Well, I was born 6 years after the Nakba in historical Palestine, but it was already the state of Israel when I was born in 1954. So obviously, in terms of national identity, biological or ethnic identity, I'm not a Palestinian. But from a very early age, my whole political and academic career evolved around solidarity with the Palestinian people to a very high degree. And I think that while you do that, especially if you live in historical Palestine and if you were born in historical Palestine, it means that there must be multiple definitions for what it means Palestinian in many ways. So it's, on the one hand, the most important one, definitely, is your national and biological and ethnic connection. But there is an ideological identity of being a Palestinian, which I think I come very close to be one. And in many ways, the future might determine one's past identity, because if what the vision I believe in, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit later, the vision I believe in one democratic historical Palestine, would mean that I would be born in a country that still can be Palestine in the future. So I would be a Palestinian by association if that particular scenario in which I believe and I'm working for might come true. So for me, it is really the highest level of solidarity, identification with the struggle, and committing myself entirely to that struggle for justice and reconciliation in Palestine.
Now, your biographical work, Out of the Frame, a fascinating read, by the way, in which you seek to answer the question you're often faced with: when and how did you transform your perception on the Palestinian-Israeli reality? You described 1982 as a pivotal period. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, definitely. In fact, the book itself was written because this question appeared and reappeared in all my public appearances. And I said that actually I need to write a book because there is no soundbite answer to that question. Namely, there's no specific date in one's life when you have this epiphany and suddenly you change everything you believed in. I mentioned in the book 1982 because I think it was a very formative moment when I was both working as an historian on one war and experiencing from the outside another one. And there were a lot of similarities between the gap between the way the war was depicted in Israel and by its supporters on the one hand, and the way you could see it for yourself without wearing the glasses or the lenses of Zionism. And I think that was very, for me personally, was a very important moment where I could really liberate myself, I think, from an ideological indoctrination and education, which I received from a very early age. But to be honest, one should say there is never, and I know it from other people, there's never really the moment. It's a journey. It has stations, important station, and definitely 1982 was a very important station. But there were other stations and other influences, and it's a journey. There is a moment where you sort of cross a river and you know you will never return to where you have been before, but you only realize it in hindsight. You don't know. You don't understand it when it really happens. But definitely 82 was an eye-opener for me. I wish I knew it before. I was there before with this kind of more fresh and liberated view, but it came in the right moment for me, because before I started my academic career and before I really became kind of a mature political person. So it came in the right time.
And so, okay, look, you have also mentioned when colonialism was fused with romantic nationalism, it produced this elimination of the native population, not only in a vision of the future, but in actual policies of ethnic cleansing on the ground, as happened in 1948. The Palestinians were not driven out discreetly as Herzl recommended, but remained unnoticed by most. Could you elaborate on what you mean by unnoticed, and what does it look like on the ground and through your experiences about, what you've witnessed with your time in the region?
Yes, what I meant was that actually from the very moment there was an ideological movement emerged in Europe in the late 19th century that regarded the return of the Jews, as they would call it, to Palestine and the creation of a Jewish state there as the only solution, either for anti-Semitism or from a Christian point of view, actually the only anti-Semitic solution to the Jewish problem was to kick them out of Europe and put them in Palestine. From that moment onwards, there was, from a Western point of view, there seems to be a total denial of the existence of the Palestinians as an indigenous native people who have the right for their own state, for their own self-determination and freedom. And I think when you are there on the ground, you can connect between the big picture, big historical picture, where you know and you can analyze the coalition which faced the Palestinians that actually denied their existence, sort of eliminated them not only physically, but eliminated them metaphorically and ideologically from their own homeland. You could sort of connect between that big historical picture to the small daily experiences you saw yourself on the ground, whether it was a place where Palestinians were not allowed to live anymore, or a place from which the Palestinians were expelled, or where their houses were demolished and their families were ethnically cleansed. In fact, a whole day on the ground shows you the daily translations of this denial and actually an attempt to eliminate an indigenous native people. And of course, this did not succeed because of the Palestinian resilience, resistance, Thank God, some people around the world who are not and were not blind to what was going on. But it's a constant struggle for survival and existence and against denial, which is still depicted in the mainstream media in the West and in the mainstream academia and by the main politics in the West, as if it is a conflict between two national movements with equal rights, equal powers, fighting for the same piece of land at best. I mean, I'm not talking about those who unconditionally support Israel, I'm talking about those who regard themselves as liberal, open-minded Westerners. And this depiction has nothing to do with the history of Palestine and the Palestinians in the last 100 years. And I think that's what I was talking about, this kind of you can write about it from the outside, but you can only see it for what it is from the inside. And we have to do both things in order to understand the challenge that we are facing.
And the dehumanization process on Palestinians, which goes hand in hand with the ethnic cleansing that has been taking place. How has this been orchestrated in your view? And what has this meant for Palestinian identity over the time that has gone past since the beginning of the century?
Yeah.
Last century, to be specific.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think we should say, first of all, generally speaking, that projects like Zionism, settler colonial projects, which at the heart had the idea of eliminating the native or the indigenous people, needed to dehumanize the natives or the indigenous people first. Otherwise, they could not do what they have done, because after all, they were coming from an enlightened, civilized Europe, and if they would have treated the native people, whether in America or in Australia or in Palestine, as equal human beings, it would be very difficult even to justify for themselves what they've done. So I think even a preliminary stage before the elimination is the dehumanization. So they are being called savages, which is, the language used both by white settlers in America and Zionist settlers in Palestine. And so the dehumanization starts even before one local indigenous person is being killed, wounded, or ethnically cleansed. And it is manifested in the writing, in the drawings, in the speeches of the settlers. What for me is very disturbing, of course, that while I know it happened elsewhere in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even 19th century, I think this dehumanization still continues in historical Palestine today. The way Palestinians in the West Bank are treated in the checkpoints is one awful example for this dehumanization. The way children in the West Bank are treated and sent to special prisons for children is another horrific manifestation. The siege on Gaza is another one. The way both in Lebanon in 2006 and since 2006 in the Gaza Strip, citizens were exposed to military might that is usually used against brigades of tanks and armored vehicles, and were targeted as if they were military bases, is another form. I think for us today in 2021, it is on the one hand the treatment of Gaza, which really is one of the worst forms of dehumanization I've seen in many years in Palestine. But also the daily, I mean, they're not as existentially dangerous, but they are as barbaric as the other one, are the daily experience of Palestinians in the West Bank in particular, when they go through an Israeli checkpoint. Again, it doesn't mean that people are being killed or wounded, but the daily humiliation, which stems from dehumanization, is something that poisons everything around it, and is something that we should be aware of and include it in our justification for struggle for justice by the means that we are using today for liberating Palestine.
And we're living in an exceptional era at the moment with the pandemic and the COVID-19 outbreak that's taking place in the region as well. How has this dehumanization been taking place within this context? Has it, how has it worsened on the ground? And how do you know of any of the way? Do you know the policies that are being carried out with Israel and how they're affecting Palestinians in terms of COVID? And the COVID cases, treatments in hospital.
Yes, definitely. I think that the worst part that came out in the pandemic with regard to dehumanization is the fact that it feels like the Israeli government feels that it has a leverage, another leverage to use in order to extract concessions or submission from the Palestinian side. So treatment, movement of injections or masks or whatever is needed to struggle against the pandemic is always conditioned in Israel and is regarded as something which can lead to some political gains or what they would call security gains. This was particularly evident in Gaza, where the ghettoized community there needs access to the world, and would still need access to the world, and is used in order to pressure the people in Gaza to accept the Israeli dictates. Similarly, the way Israel uses now closures on the West Bank in order to justify it as if it is a health decision, a decision not to spread the virus into Israel. We know that this is nothing to do with the health condition. This is just another justification to strangulate the people who live there in order to implement fully their vision that was so clearly articulated, both in the Trump deal of the century and in the Israeli 2018 nationality law of turning the whole of historical Palestine into a Jewish state with an apartheid system imposed on the Palestinians. So definitely, I think this is just another. But as people in Gaza would tell you, it's probably one of few places in the world that the situation was so bad and the inhumanity was so so apparent that the COVID-19, of course, adds to the suffering. But we should remember it was already in a very, very dire situation before COVID-19. The United Nations already signified last year as a year in which most communities living under the conditions that people live in Gaza, that they would not be sustainable. And surely the pandemic is making these conditions even less sustainable than they were.
And do you think that Israel is taking advantage of the pandemic in terms of its peace deals with the Arab world and the normalization process that's taking place at the moment too? And with the Arab normalizations, what effect do you think it's having on Palestinian identity and how they're evolving within the Middle East?
I don't think the normalization process is directly connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. No, I think this is much more the result of the Trump administration policy and the way certain Arab regimes responded to that initiative. The basic idea of this initiative is that if you, as an Arab regime, believe that your future depends on the United States of America, the only way of ensuring that kind of American support goes through Israel. So if you want our financial, our economic, our military support against real or imaginary enemies from within and from without, we have a new demand from you. And that demand is normalization with Israel. If you don't accept it, you will not receive our support. I think that's the main motive for that kind of behavior by certain Arab regimes. This affects the Palestinian on several levels, of course. One is that even the Arab regimes themselves in 2002 signed the Arab League peace plan that was initiated by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia in 2002, which said very clearly that there could not be normalization with Israel without a solution that would be accepted by the Palestinians. So they are violating, first of all, their own official commitment to the Palestinians. So that's one effect. The second one is that they are giving Israel a legitimacy to continue with actions on the ground, which are meant to try, or at least an attempt to destroy the Palestinian as a political force, and to claim that the people there don't have political rights. They might have some humanitarian and economic problems, but they hope that the Arab world will help them to solve them. But there's really an attempt to sort of wipe out the idea that the Palestinians have the right of self-determination, the right of return, and so on. So this is the other effect. Of course, two things should be said about this. One is that the Arab regime's position does not reflect the position of the Arab civil society in most countries. And I think that this is another gap. It's not the only one, the gap between official policies of Arab regimes and the aspiration of Arab people, and a genuine process of democratization in the Arab world, I think, would make these Arab governments much more committed to the Palestine issue than they are today. That's one point. And the second point is that it won't help Israel. In the end of the day, the only normalization that would assure some normal, natural, safe life for Jews in historical Palestine is normalizing the relationship with the Palestinians. Normalizing relationship with Abu Dhabi doesn't change anything on the ground, and does not turn Israel from an apartheid state to a democracy, and does not turn Israel from an alien community in the Arab world into a welcomed one. So in the long run, I don't think these normalization agreements would change the basic reality that either Israel would continue and be sustained as an apartheid state, or eventually, for whatever reasons, we will be able to transform it and see here a country which is democratic and respect the rights of everyone who lived here and those who were expelled from it.
Now, you've mentioned in your book also is that, that you hope that within, now it's a pretty far out trajectory for the next 50 years of the bicentenary of Herzl's birth in 2060, or of his death by 2104, where we celebrated in a democratic secular state of Palestine that has overcome the evils of both nationalism and colonialism. Now that states that a Palestinian, you've also said in other places and countless times of there being only a one-state solution, and that we should forget there ever being a two-state solution in the first place. Could you comment on these ideas further?
Yeah, well, I was very safe when I pointed out to a date where I probably will not be around, so nobody could say to me you were wrong. But what I wanted to say by this, that we have to accept that it's a long process. It's not an immediate process, and we need to continue whatever we're doing for that by realizing that it's not going to happen soon, but every year that we invest enough effort in it brings us closer to this, even if it doesn't look to be around the corner right now. The other point is that I think around 2000, about sort of 20, 21 years ago, anyone with a modicum of decency on the one hand, and even a minimal knowledge of what was going on in historical Palestine must have realized that the two-state solution, even if they thought it was a good idea, was dead for all intents and purposes. And I mentioned the year 2000, especially after the Intifada al-Aqsa, after the second Intifada, second uprising, is because after that uprising, Israel began a unilateral policy of establishing facts on the ground to turn the whole, or as much of historical Palestine as possible, into greater Israel. Until 2000, you could still be mistaken and forgiven for thinking that the idea of a greater Israel, for instance, was a marginal position among Israelis. But it was very clear that all the governments since 2001 until today, our governments fully believe in such a policy and a strategy. Now, once this is the policy and the strategy, there is no real actor with power and importance that pushes for a two-state solution. Yes, there is support for the idea among European countries and among the United States and what is called the Quartet, which includes Russia and the United Nations, and the Palestinian Authority believes in it. But all these actors, which I just enumerated, are not as important as Israel, because all of them accept that the balance of power is such that only if Israel accepts a two-state solution, there's a chance for a two-state solution. It doesn't matter whether the Palestinians accept it or not, or whether Arab regimes accept it or not, or whether Norway and Mexico accept it. What matters is if Israel accepts it. And Israel doesn't accept it anymore. It doesn't feel the need for it because it already established facts on the ground that have turned the whole historical homeland of the Palestinians into a Jewish state, either under direct Israeli rule or indirect Israeli rule. It doesn't matter. Which really means that a struggle for freedom, justice, and liberation looks quite ridiculous if it is fought for a two-state solution under such circumstances. It is if the ANC at a certain point would say in South Africa, you know what, we are fighting for a non-apartheid zone in 1/3 of South Africa, and we'll be very happy with this. This would have never been accepted by the ANC. So I know that this is a tall thing to ask from this disunited, fragmented Palestinian national liberation movement to do, but I can't see any other vision which would replace the present reality on the ground.
Well, you just mentioned fragmented Palestinian national organization. Now, what are the contributing factors to this fragmentation? And what advice would you have to overcome this fragmentation?
Well, I think the reasons for this fragmentation have to do first and foremost with the physical fragmentation imposed on the Palestinian people as a result of the Nakba. Palestinians were divided by force into different geopolitical groups. Some of them were under different Israeli control or other Arab regimes' control. And this naturally created different agendas, despite the very important and effective in many ways attempt by the PLO for many years to keep all these groups together in one consensual vision and identity, which I think they have succeeded in many ways in doing, but that I think was lost with the Oslo Accord, or maybe started to be lost already after the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon in 1983. So first, this is the first factor, the factors of the goal and strategy and its implementation of the Zionist movement. Secondly, of course, one should not absolve the Palestinian political elite from its own inability to unite in the right moment. I know how difficult it is, but without such a unity, it's very difficult to see how you can exploit the huge support and solidarity that the Palestinians enjoy around the world, especially among civil societies, and how to exploit it into something that would really push forward the project of liberation and freedom. I don't have any secret formula of how to convince people to unite. Very carefully, because I'm not an advisor and I don't want to be an advisor, I would say that as an academic, but really only as an academic, I can see only two options. Either you change the nature of the PLO and make it a representative body for all the Palestinians, maybe even include some anti-Zionist Jews in it, because you need the model of the ANC, I think, if you want to rejuvenate the PLO, or you create a new organization altogether that represents more democratically, authentically, the needs of the Palestinian people in the 21st century. Some of the ideas of the Palestinian liberation movement from the 60s and the 70s of the previous century are still relevant and are still guiding us, I think, when we look towards the future. But quite a few of them have to be adapted to a new reality that was not there in the 60s and the 70s, and only an adapted, a realistic kind of a view on the reality on the ground can produce, I think, a good program for the future.
How do you think the ideological frameworks that have been, both, actually, let me more specifically say, the religious ideological frameworks that have been imposed on the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, both from the past, quote unquote Palestinian side, but I would say more of a political Islamist side, and on top of the Christian Zionism that exists throughout the world, and reigniting this crusader image that has been imposed on the conflict. How do you think has affected its trajectory and the way that foreign policy is playing out, even though foreign policy in the international realm claims to be secular, or a lot of the countries that are involved in pushing this narrative claim to be secular in the way that they govern? What effects do you think it's had on the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, and how far, and what do you see as like sort of the trajectory of it?
Well, first of all, let's state very clearly that the struggle in Palestine has never been a religious one. It was a struggle between a settler colonial movement that in many ways was a secular settler colonial movement that wanted to turn Judaism from a religion into a national identity. And the Palestinian resistance to that, the anti-colonialist Palestinian resistance, was not religious in nature. It includes the Christians and the Muslims who struggle one alongside the other in the names of self-determination, independence, and freedom. So I think that's very important to explain. Secondly, it is true that political movements within both sides were and are using religion in order to enhance their political position. I think the situation is a bit more complicated on both sides by the fact that religion as a whole plays a very important role in the life of many people, Jews and Palestinians. And the whole theory of modernization, which led the imperial and colonial policies toward the Middle East and some of the secular leadership, as if religion and faith does not or is about to stop playing any role in people's life, proved to be utterly wrong. And there is this fusion and sometimes confusion between the way religion returned and faith, not just religion, also faith, returned to play an important role in the life of individuals and collectives, despite this vision of a secular modernized society on the one hand, and the way this process is used cynically by politicians in order to enhance very fanatic, extreme point of view towards anyone who is not you. And I think that it shows you that even after we will resolve the outstanding questions on the Palestine issue, which are the right of return, equal rights to everyone, and the rectification of past evils by creating a more equal society, we will still have to find a way, like the rest of the Middle East, maybe the rest of the world, how to navigate in a dialogical way between people with various ideas about tradition, religion, secularism. There's a lot of work to be done there to create a live and let live society as such. But I think under the pressure of oppression and anti-oppression, it is very difficult to find the space and the energy to deal properly with these issues, and they can become very superficial and, as you say, at times very, very dangerous. I think Christian Zionism is even something that is beyond that discussion, because I think that sort of brings into the fore the fact that Zionism began as a Christian project before it became a Jewish project. But I think you're right. I mean, it's another example where religion is manipulated in order to justify injustice. I think this is something the Christian community around the world will need to deal with much more than we in Palestine, or those who are not Christians in Palestine should deal with, because it really tarnishes Christianity, as did the Islamic State tarnish Islam, I think, in many ways, and as to my mind, Zionism did the same to Judaism. So we have three ideological movements that try to represent themselves as the religion itself, but they're not. And I think this is a struggle that will continue.
Thank you for that. And I mean, one of my sort of final questions is on Nakba denial and what it is. And it's a cause that I see you reiterating on many platforms, and an issue that has, obviously plagued the issue. And I would like you to comment more on that, please.
Yeah, definitely. I still think this is a crucial project, and I hope one day to create, with the help of a lot of people, a center against Nakba denial in England. I really think that this is a necessary project, which until now has never come into fruition because people were afraid to represent it nationally, and the fragmentation and disunity. But I think it's a crucial project, because the two reasons why the Nakba denial is so important to what's happening today. One is, as we call it in Arabic, the Nakba is an ongoing event. It's al-Nakba al-Mustamira, the ongoing Nakba. It means that, as in the case of many settler colonial projects, settler colonialism is not an event. It's a structure. It's a historical structure. And when the main motive for a settler colonial movement, which is to remove the local population, has not been fully implemented, and not successfully implemented, most of its policies towards the local people, in this case the Palestinians, continue to be informed by this incompletion. So I think we should explain to people that the same motivation and ideology that stood behind the demolition of half of Palestine's villages, the destruction of most of its towns, and the expulsion of half of its population, the same motive and ideology is now the state ideology, and it still informs similar policies of ethnic cleansing as it did in 1948, even if they are not on the same magnitude. So that's one reason one should not allow the Nakba to be denied. The second one is no less important. I think that the inability, even of people like, the former President Barack Obama and other academics and politicians in the West, who seem to be more open-minded and liberal, to understand the magnitude of the crime committed against the Palestinians in 1948, their unwillingness or inability, whatever the reason is, means that they will never fully understand why there is a conflict in Palestine, and what is the nature of that conflict, and why it is actually, the word conflict itself is not very suitable for describing what goes on there. And this, of course, all affects the solution itself. So we need to insist that in high schools, universities, in popular culture, in high culture, the Nakba should be mentioned, recollected, and we should struggle against, as we should struggle, and I'm all for it, as we should struggle against the Holocaust denial. I think both events should, like so many other human atrocities against other humans, should not be denied, should be commemorated, should be taught so that the necessary lessons should be drawn from it. The fact that the Palestinians walked around when people told them they are not victims of a crime is as bad as being a victim to the crime itself.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. Are there any other sort of concluding remarks that you would like to make on the topic that we've discussed today, and any comments that you would like to make? Because the whole point is to empower Palestinian voices and their narrative and what they like to push forward, rather than having to deal with the mainstream. So, are there any comments that you would like to make as for a conclusion?
Maybe three short comments. One is that we still should remember that for many, many people, especially young people around the world, justice for Palestine is equated for justice for all, especially social justice. This is a very powerful sentiment that is very apparent in many parts of the world. We should remember that, and we should know how best to use it and rely on it to help and change the reality for those who are really the direct victims as Palestinians on the ground. That's the first point. The second point is, I think that what became very clear in the last 4 years, any attempt to try and change the United States or America as the only way of changing the reality in Palestine has proved itself to be wrong. We should look for other states, for other continents, and ask them to be involved with what happens in Palestine, because I think the Americans have bitterly disappointed us with their dishonest brokery and the way that they behaved and the havoc and destruction that they helped to leave behind. And I think it's very important for all of us to see how we can engage other countries and states in our future. And finally, I think we should also remember that the Palestinian community is one of the youngest in the world and has a lot of impressive young people who could really move forward and push forward, hopefully in solidarity with other young people who are fighting for equally just causes among indigenous people, oppressed minorities like the African Americans, and other communities that suffer either from economic or national or religious oppression. I think this international solidarity is what helped keep the Palestinian issue alive in the 70s, and it should now help us to move forward and change the reality on the ground. Thank you.
Great. And on that positive remark, I shall come to an end to this episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor, and giving us your incredible insight. And I would like to thank you, our audience, for watching. Our next episode will be on Saturday at the same time, where we will be in conversation with Yasser Qous, who is the head of the Afro-Palestinian Society in Jerusalem. And I would like to thank everybody on behalf of Identity International. Thank you.